The wind carried the last breath of winter across the wide Montana valley, moving over the land the way a tired hand smooths a wrinkled quilt. The fields were pale and sleeping, stitched with old fences and shadows, and the sky above looked washed clean by cold storms that had wandered through just days earlier. It was the kind of morning that felt like a held breath. Even the birds waited before announcing their place in the season. The world seemed suspended, listening for something unnamed. Hilton Cartwright stepped out of his cabin with a stiff quietness, the boards groaning under his boots. He was 36 and carried his years like a man who had learned too early how grief hollows a home. His late wife, May, had been gone 2 winters now, but the echo of her still lingered in corners. Soft reminders tucked into quilts, quiet impressions in the dust of the windowsill. He didn't speak of her to anyone. Not because he wished to forget, but because his voice felt too rough to handle something so gentle. He moved with deliberate calm, feeding the horses, checking the barn door that liked to unhook in strong wind, gathering the smaller tasks before the larger ones took shape. Hilton wasn't a man who hurried. He had the patience of a mountain, the kind built from endurance rather than confidence. Folks liked to say he was dependable, steady as an old oak, but they whispered sometimes, too, that he lived too quiet, too alone. His face turned more toward memories than toward living company. He ignored the whispers, though the edges of them reached him through the long days. Ever since he sent word to a settler agency across the territories, offering money for a practical wife, one who could help keep the ranch running, who wouldn't mind the silence, who might tolerate a man whose laughter had gone thin, people in town had given him looks he felt rather than saw. Practical arrangements weren't uncommon, but folks still judged what they didn't understand. They didn't know that loneliness can feel like a field with no fences, just open space and no place to root. The stagecoach was due at noon. Hilton found himself checking the sun's position more times than he cared to admit. He didn't know the woman's name. The agency had sent only her age, 27, her ability to cook, mend, keep house, and her willingness to work without complaint. It sounded like a list written for someone who didn't expect affection. A list written for someone who had learned to shrink their needs down to nothing. He wondered what kind of life she was leaving behind. What kind of hope or desperation pushed her into this arrangement? He hoped she wasn't afraid. He hoped she had strength. He hoped he wouldn't fail her the way he sometimes feared he'd failed May, not in action, but in the quiet ways a man fails to soften himself while he still can. The sun climbed higher, catching the frost still clinging to the grass, making it shimmer like silver threads. The sound of hooves reached him long before the stagecoach appeared. Hilton wiped his hands on his trousers, feeling the familiar steadiness of his breath settle into his bones. Whatever came next, he would meet it with the same quiet determination that had carried him through every hard season. The stagecoach emerged from behind the rise, wheels kicking up soft plumes of dust. It slowed, shuddering to a stop by the gate. The driver tipped his hat and climbed down, opening the door only after offering a small encouraging nod toward whoever waited inside. Hilton stepped forward, heart steady but heavy. He wasn't expecting beauty. He wasn't expecting warmth. He was expecting someone resigned, someone worn thin by life the way the agency's letter had quietly implied. What he saw instead was a young woman stepping down with care, her gloved hand trembling as it reached for the railing. She carried a single trunk, old, battered, but held as if it guarded everything she owned. Her dress was simple, travel-creased, and her boots carried dust from roads she probably wished she'd never seen. She lifted her head slowly, as though afraid the wind might sweep her away if she moved too fast. Her name, the driver finally murmured, was Clara Bennett. Clara looked at the land with hesitant eyes, taking in the wide fields, the silent cabin, the mountains guarding the horizon. Her face held a quiet strength, the kind shaped by hardship rather than praise. There was nothing loud about her. Not her posture, not her expression, not even the way she breathed. She stood like someone who had learned not to take up too much space. Someone who had been told again and again that her value lived only in how well she served others. Hilton felt something shift, subtle but undeniable. Not attraction. Not amazement. Just recognition. 2 quiet people, meeting in the middle of a cold morning, each carrying more history than they knew how to share. She approached him with a careful, nearly timid nod. Her voice, when it came, was soft enough to blend with the wind. "I will work hard. I don't expect comforts. I only ask for fairness. It wasn't a greeting. It was a survival instinct. For a moment Hilton could only stare, understanding more than her words revealed. He realized she truly believed she was here only for utility, that she expected no kindness in return. That someone somewhere had made her mistake quiet for lack of worth. He cleared his throat, letting the cold air ground him. You'll have a roof, meals, and your own room. I ask only that we treat each other with decency. Clara nodded again, holding her trunk closer, as if bracing for something she couldn't name. They walked toward the cabin, neither speaking. The silence between them felt fragile but not empty. Hilton opened the door for her, and Clara stepped inside as if entering a place she didn't deserve. Dust spun in the sunlight like tiny drifting stars. Her eyes moved over the room with gentle caution, and he watched her take in the space that would become her new life. He almost spoke, almost said she could rest, or warm herself, or breathe, but something in her posture stopped him. She looked like a person waiting for permission simply to exist. Before he could find the right words, she turned toward him, her voice barely above a whisper. There was one question she needed answered before she could anchor herself in this unfamiliar land. Hilton, she asked softly, what exactly did you expect me to be? The morning after Clara arrived, the house breathed differently. Hilton noticed it the moment he stepped into the kitchen and saw the faint curl of steam rising from a kettle she must have set on the stove before dawn. She moved quietly through the cabin, her footsteps soft as moth wings, as if afraid to disturb the very air she now shared with him. She greeted him with a small nod, not quite meeting his eyes, and went back to slicing bread with a measured, almost apologetic rhythm. He thanked her, and she murmured something he couldn't quite catch, her voice folding inward like a sheet pulled close. Throughout the following days, Clara settled into the cabin the way a creek learns to run around stones, never demanding space, only adapting to what already existed. She washed linens, hung them outside where the weak spring sun tried to warm them. She aired out rooms that had long surrendered to dust. She patched Hilton's shirts with tiny, perfect stitches that spoke of hands used to mending things that couldn't talk back. She cooked meals simple but steady, never wasting ingredients, never lingering long enough for praise. Everything she did seemed shaped by an invisible restraint, as if she feared that doing too much or too little might unsettle the fragile understanding between them. Hilton watched her more than he spoke, not with judgment but with quiet puzzlement. He had expected a woman hardened by necessity, brisk and practical, perhaps irritated with the life she'd stepped into. Instead he found someone who moved like she'd been taught that silence was safer than expression. He found himself wanting to ask about her past, but each time he tried, he stopped himself, sensing that her history was stitched into her posture, not meant to be tugged at too quickly. Tommy Fitch, the ranch hand who worked mornings, noticed her long before Hilton realized he'd been staring at her too much. Tommy watched her hang laundry one afternoon, shaking his head with begrudging admiration. She works cleaner than a church bell, he muttered, adjusting the saddle Hilton had asked him to mend. But she don't smile none. Hilton said nothing, though he felt a faint ache at Tommy's words. He wondered when he'd last earned a smile from anyone, much less from a woman living under the same roof. Mrs. Hollander made her appearance 2 days later, her sharp eyes sweeping the cabin like a broom meant to collect gossip. She brought a loaf of bread wrapped in cloth, though her reasons were anything but kind. "So this is the woman you bought," she said, not bothering to soften the words. Clara stiffened, her hands pausing mid-wipe on the table. Hilton felt heat rise under his collar, a frustration he rarely allowed himself to show. Mrs. Hollander's gaze drifted to Clara, lingering with a smug curiosity that made Clara fold inward even more. "Hope you ain't regretting it yet," she said, leaving the bread on the counter like an insult dressed as charity. After the door shut behind her, Clara touched the cloth-wrapped loaf with trembling fingers. She didn't lift her eyes. Hilton wanted to explain, to say something that might ease the weight of the woman's cruelty, but words felt clumsy on his tongue. Instead, he took the loaf and placed it on the far shelf, out of sight. Clara watched him quietly, her expression unreadable, but something in the room loosened, a small thread pulled free from a tightly woven fear. That evening, after Tommy left and the sun dipped low across the valley, Clara stepped outside to fetch water from the well. Hilton followed shortly after, wanting fresh air more than he wanted conversation. He found her standing still, bucket forgotten at her feet, staring at the horizon as if searching for something she couldn't name. The wind caught a loose strand of her hair, brushing it across her cheek. She tucked it back with the same care she used for everything she touched. "Do you need help with the bucket?" Hilton asked, though she'd already lifted it. She shook her head gently. "I can manage." Her voice held no defiance, only habit. Habit of doing tasks alone, habit of expecting no assistance, habit of believing her worth rested in labor. Hilton stepped closer, not near enough to crowd her, but close enough for her to know she wasn't alone in the dusk. "Clara," he said quietly, "you don't have to prove anything here." Her grip on the bucket tightened, her knuckles paling. "I'm not proving," she murmured, though the words felt unsteady. "I'm simply fulfilling the reason I'm here." He wished she hadn't said it like that. He wished he didn't understand exactly what she meant. Before he could answer, she lifted the bucket and carried it back toward the cabin, the fading light sketching a small, lonely figure against the land. The next morning brought a silence thicker than the day before. Clara spoke less, worked more, and carried herself like someone trying to shrink even further. Hilton noticed the dark smudges under her eyes, the way she hesitated before entering rooms, as if testing whether her presence was welcome. He wanted to tell her it was. He wanted to step toward her instead of watching from a careful distance. But he wasn't used to soft things. He wasn't used to reaching out first. Later that afternoon, Clara dropped a pan on the floor, the clang erupting like a gunshot in the quiet cabin. She froze, breath caught in her throat, panic flashing through her eyes. Hilton rushed in from outside, startled by the noise. When he saw her trembling, he softened immediately, stepping slowly into the room. "It's just a pan, Clara," he said. His voice lowered, gentle enough to cradle a bird. "You're all right." She swallowed hard, but her hands still shook. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "I should have been more careful. I shouldn't disturb." Her apology broke something loose in him. "Clara," he said again, this time quieter, "you don't have to apologize for existing." For the first time since she'd arrived, she lifted her gaze to his fully, no shield, no practiced distance. And in that single moment, Hilton saw the truth she'd been hiding, the certainty that she believed her place in his home depended entirely on being flawless, silent, and useful. He opened his mouth to reassure her, to offer something real, but before he could speak, she stepped back, her breath unsteady. Then, with a voice thin as cracked glass, she asked a question he had not seen coming, a question born from fear far older than their arrangement. "If I stopped being useful to you, Hilton, would you send me away?" The question hung in the room long after Clara spoke it, trembling between them like a loose lantern flame threatened by a draft. Hilton stood still, struck not by the words themselves, but by the fear braided into them. "Would you send me away?" Such a simple question, yet rooted in wounds he had not earned but was now staring at directly. He opened his mouth, but the answer caught somewhere between his chest and his throat. Clara mistook his silence for confirmation, and a small shudder passed through her expression, so brief he might have missed it if he hadn't been watching her so closely. She turned away before he could say anything, gathered the fallen pan, and washed it with movements painfully precise. Hilton wanted to stop her, to explain, to reach across the invisible line between them, but he found himself caught by caution. He wasn't a man who knew how to heal someone with words. He only knew quiet labor, steady loyalty, and the way the land responded to patience. But Clara wasn't land. She was something far more delicate, something carrying storms she never allowed to break the surface. That evening the cabin felt different, as though the walls themselves sensed a tension they didn't know how to hold. Clara kept to her side of the table during supper, her posture neat and controlled, her eyes lowered. When Hilton thanked her for the meal, she gave a small nod but did not lift her gaze. He felt the absence of her eyes like the absence of sunlight. He'd grown used to the way she glanced at him when she thought he wasn't looking. Those faint, flickering moments had become something he looked forward to, though he hadn't admitted it aloud. After supper, Clara excused herself to tend the linens. Hilton stepped out onto the porch, needing air. The sky was washing itself into twilight, colors sinking into the horizon like spilled ink. He leaned against the railing, listening to the soft clatter of Clara's work drifting through the open window. Every sound she made seemed hesitant, as if she expected rebuke for existing too loudly. It twisted something in him, something old and aching. He remembered May then, but not with grief that cut, more with a quiet acceptance of a man who had loved once and lost gently. May had been bright, lively, laughing often. Clara was not May. She was quiet where May had been bold, reserved where May had been warm. And yet, Clara stirred something Hilton hadn't felt in a long time, something like the gentlest beginning of hope. But he knew better than to rush such fragile things. They needed room to breathe, room to grow roots strong enough to weather the winds. When he stepped inside again, Clara had already finished her chores and retreated to her small room. The door was cracked open just enough for lamplight to escape, casting a thin golden line across the hallway floor. Hilton paused, listening to the faint rustle of her dress as she moved. He wondered what she thought of him, whether she feared him or merely feared disappointing him. The thought unsettled him deeply. The next morning, Clara woke earlier than usual, though Hilton suspected she hadn't slept much. He found her already in the kitchen, hair braided neatly down her back, sleeves rolled to her elbows, preparing dough for bread. Her movements were meticulous, but her eyes seemed distant, as though she were somewhere else entirely. He greeted her softly, and she nodded without looking up. He waited until she set the dough aside before speaking. Clara, about yesterday, she flinched ever so slightly, hands folding together in front of her apron. "You don't need to explain," she said, her voice quiet but firm. "I understand my place here." Her place. The words clouded the room like dust unsettled by a sudden step. Hilton took a slow breath. "Clara, you're not here because you're useful. You're here because—" He stopped, unsure how to finish. "Because I needed someone? Because loneliness had carved a hole in him? Because he found himself wanting her presence more than he expected? None of those felt fair to place on her shoulders. Because you deserved a place where you're treated with decency," he said finally. Clara's eyes flickered, soft but unreadable, before turning away. She didn't argue, but she didn't accept his words either. Not truly. She carried them like someone bracing for the moment they were proven false. Later that day, Tommy arrived to help with the horses. Clara brought him a plate of biscuits she'd made, offering them with quiet politeness. Tommy grinned, biting into one. "These are good, ma'am." Clara's lips curved in the smallest smile, but it vanished the moment she noticed Hilton watching. She stepped back, folding into herself again. Tommy looked between them, confused, but said nothing. Children often understand silence better than adults. He returned to the yard, muttering to the horses about mysteries he didn't have words for yet. As the afternoon stretched long, Clara worked in the garden behind the cabin, kneeling in soil still cool from winter. Hilton watched from the porch, admiring the careful way she pressed new roots into the earth, as if coaxing the land to trust her. A breeze lifted the strands of her hair, and she paused, lifting her face toward the wind with a softness that struck him unexpectedly. She looked peaceful. For the first time since she arrived, she looked like someone who belonged somewhere. He walked toward her, quiet as habit allowed. When she noticed his shadow, she startled, immediately lowering her gaze. "I didn't mean to keep you from your work," she murmured. He shook his head. "You're not in my way, Clara." She nodded, but he wasn't sure she believed him. They worked side by side in silence, planting new seeds into furrows she had shaped with her hands. The sunlight warmed the earth, warmed their shoulders, warmed something unspoken between them. It was the kind of silence that could have been comforting, but Clara held herself too stiffly for comfort to settle. As the sun dipped behind the hills, Hilton finally gathered enough courage to speak the words that had gnawed at him since she asked her question. "Clara, I wouldn't send you away. Not for any reason. Not ever." She went very still, her breath catching. But before she could respond, a sharp snap echoed through the yard, footsteps approaching, hurried and heavy. Tommy came running from the barn, his face pale with urgency, eyes wide with a warning that would shift everything. "Hilton," he gasped, "you need to come quick. Someone rode into town asking about the woman living on your ranch. And they don't sound like they mean well." For a moment nothing moved. Not the wind, not the dust, not Clara's breath. Tommy's urgent words settled over the yard like a sudden frost. Someone asking about the woman on Hilton's ranch. Someone who meant no good by it. Clara's hand flew to her chest, her eyes widening with a pain so old it had its own memory. Hilton stepped instinctively closer, not touching her but creating a quiet shield with his presence. He could feel her trembling though she stood a full step away. "Tell me exactly what you heard," Hilton said, voice low. Tommy swallowed hard. Man came into the saloon looking rough and mean. Asked if anybody knew where a Clara Bennett ended up. Said she ran off with something that wasn't hers. Folks didn't answer, but he sounded real sure she was close. Clara's knees weakened just slightly, but she righted herself with the grace of someone used to surviving blows she never deserved. Her gaze drifted to the horizon as if expecting a shadow to rise from it. Hilton studied her carefully. "Clara, is there someone who'd come looking for you?" Her lips parted, but no words came at first. She stared down at her fingers still stained with soil. After a long breath, she whispered, "He's not my husband. He was never that. But he believed I belonged to him. He believed everything I touched belonged to him too." Hilton felt something dangerous stir in him, a fierce quiet protectiveness that surprised even him. "You're safe here," he said, steady as stone. But Clara shook her head gently. Men like him don't believe in safe. They walked toward the cabin together, the air thick with the weight of unspoken truths. Inside, Clara sat at the small wooden table, her hands twisting together so tightly he feared she might bruise herself. Hilton poured her water, though she was too shaken to drink it. When she did speak, her voice carried both fragility and resolve. His name was Warren Pike. My father owed him money. He wanted a servant, not a wife, but my father promised him I'd work the debt. I left before he could make good on it. And now he's hunting me down." The name Warren Pike meant nothing to Hilton, but the cruelty behind it was clear in the shadows darkening Clara's eyes. "Did he harm you?" Hilton asked quietly. Clara bowed her head. "Not with fists. But he used his voice like one. Said I was nothing. Said I'd better learn to be grateful for whatever he thought I deserved." She hesitated, breath-catching. "Leaving was the first thing I ever chose for myself." Hilton felt something inside him, the part of him that had lived 2 years in silence, snapped clean open with purpose. He wasn't a man who sought conflict, but he also wasn't a man who let danger walk through his door. Still, he didn't want to frighten her with promises he couldn't shape yet. Instead, he pulled out a chair and sat across from her, letting the quiet settle between them until she looked up. "Clara," he said softly, "I'm not sending you away. I don't care what he thinks he's owed. You don't owe him anything." A fragile breath left her, half relief, half disbelief. She touched her wrist lightly, as if steadying her pulse. But her eyes, when she lifted them again, held something different, something like hope daring to surface. Hilton stood, pushing the chair back gently. "I'll speak to Tommy. Make sure he's not wandering town alone until this is settled. And I'll ride in myself to see what's true and what's rumor." Clara rose too, alarm flickering in her expression. "You shouldn't go alone. Warren. He has a way of twisting fear into advantage." Hilton offered the faintest smile. "Then he'll find he chose the wrong ranch to threaten." He stepped outside, gathering his coat from the rail, but something in him resisted leaving before speaking one more truth. Turning back to her, Clara standing in the golden spill of afternoon light, her braid loose, her face pale but determined. He said quietly, "I told you before I wouldn't send you away. That wasn't a kindness. That was a fact." She swallowed, her gaze softening. "I believe you want to protect me," she murmured, "but men make promises easier than they keep them." Hilton stepped closer, not touching her, just letting her see the certainty in his eyes. "I keep what I say." He rode into town with the weight of that vow settling into his bones. The sun was lowering, painting the sky in slow strokes of amber and rose. When Hilton reached the saloon, he didn't dismount immediately. He scanned the street, studying the unfamiliar horse tied near the hitching post, a black mare with restless hooves. It didn't belong to any local he knew. Inside, the saloon quieted the moment he entered. Conversation thinned, eyes tracking him with a mixture of curiosity and caution. Jim McCreary, the barkeep, nodded Hilton over. You looking for the fella asking after that woman of yours? Hilton stiffened, not at the implication, but at the danger coiled in the man's tone. He's upstairs, Jim whispered. Looks like trouble, but folks ain't about to get involved. Hilton thanked him silently and took the stairs with deliberate calm. When Warren Pike appeared at the top landing, Hilton saw him first as a shape, a man with broad shoulders and a smugness that leaked from every inch. Then the details sharpened. The cruel tilt of his smile, the hungry calculation in his eyes. You must be Cartwright, Warren drawled. Heard you got yourself a woman who don't rightfully belong to you. Hilton didn't blink. She doesn't belong to you either. Warren's grin widened, pleased to have found the crack he intended to pry open. She ran off with a trunk full of my property. And I aim to collect what's mine. Hilton stepped forward slowly until the air between them tightened. There was no anger in his voice, only ice-cold conviction. Whatever was in that trunk isn't worth what you're risking by coming here. Warren scoffed, but a flicker of unease crept into his posture. You really think you can keep her from me? Hilton held his gaze without blinking. I know I can. There was a long silence, long enough for the saloon to fall utterly still. Then Warren's expression shifted, not to retreat, but to something more dangerous, patient malice. He tipped his hat. Then I'll be seeing you soon, Cartwright. Real soon. Hilton didn't answer. He simply watched Warren descend the stairs with the slow, coiled confidence of a man who believed the world owed him obedience. That night, the wind returned with the chill of winter's memory. Clara stood on the porch when Hilton rode back in, her hands clasped tightly as if praying for a sign. He dismounted, walked toward her, and saw at once that she had been waiting, not with fear alone, but with a small, trembling trust. He opened his mouth to reassure her. But before he could speak, Clara whispered the words that would shift the path of everything that came next. Hilton, he found the cabin where my father lived. If he came here, then he knows exactly where I ran to. Hilton felt Clara's words settle into him like a cold shadow creeping across warm ground. If Warren had visited her father's place, then every trail leading through this valley pointed straight to Hilton's ranch. Clara stood there trembling under the porch lantern, her breath uneven, hands tightening as though bracing for a blow that hadn't yet fallen but felt inevitable. Hilton stepped closer. His voice calm though something fierce churned beneath it. You're not facing him alone, Clara. You won't ever face him alone again. She shook her head, fear flickering through her like a candle's wavering flame. You don't understand the kind of man he is. Men like him don't walk away just because they're told to. Hilton's jaw tightened. Then he'll learn a lesson he's never been taught. Clara looked up at him, her eyes full of dread and something softer, something that trusted him even when she didn't trust her own safety. That night they barely slept. Hilton kept the rifle near the door but didn't reach for it out of aggression, only necessity. Clara lay in the small room down the hall, the dim glow of her lamp spilling beneath her door like a plea that refused to disappear. At dawn she emerged with dark circles beneath her eyes but a quiet steadiness in her posture. Hilton handed her a cup of warm coffee, and when her fingers brushed his, a tremor passed between them, fragile yet grounding. He saw then how much she had endured before she'd ever arrived on his land, and he wished fiercely that he'd met her long before the world had taught her to fear her own shadow. By mid-morning, Tommy rode in from town with breathless urgency. He's here, Hilton. Rode straight through the square and asked for you by name. Said he'll come take what's his by sundown. Clara paled, her hand flying to her throat. Hilton felt something ancient rise in him. Not anger, not hatred, but a deep, unwavering need to protect the quiet woman whose life had become woven into his without either of them realizing it fully. Clara stepped toward him, voice barely a whisper. You could give me up. It would end this for you. It was not an offer. It was fear trying to spare him. Hilton moved closer until only inches stood between them. I don't give up people I care about. Her breath caught, her lips parting as though she wanted to speak but couldn't find the words. Care about? She echoed softly, almost disbelieving. He nodded once, a simple and undeniable affirmation. Her eyes glistened, tears rising not from sorrow but from a tenderness she didn't know how to carry. The hours crawled toward sundown with the slow, heavy tension of storm-laden clouds. Hilton prepared quietly, checking the fences, securing the horses, walking the perimeter with the steadiness of a man who refused to show fear. Clara followed him silently for a while, watching him with worry pressing the corners of her mouth downward. Finally she stopped him by the corral, her hand lightly catching his sleeve. "Hilton," she whispered, her voice trembling, "what if he hurts you because of me?" He turned toward her fully and placed one large hand over hers, grounding her panic. "Clara," he said gently, "some things are worth standing for. You are one of them." The sun began to sink behind the hills, washing the land in deep amber light. Clara stood on the porch while Hilton waited near the gate, the sky turning molten above him. The rhythm of hoofbeats came before the figure emerged. Warren Pike riding hard, his coat snapping behind him, his expression carved into cruel lines. He slowed only when he neared Hilton, lifting his chin with arrogance sharpened over years of taking what he wanted. "Evenin', Cartwright," Warren said, his voice dripping with smug authority. "I'd appreciate it if you stepped aside so I can reclaim what's mine." Hilton didn't move. "She isn't yours," he replied quietly. "She never was." Warren smirked. "That's where you're wrong. Her father promised her, and debts don't disappear just because a woman gets stubborn. Bring her out, or I'll come take her myself." Before Hilton could answer, Clara stepped down from the porch, moving with a bravery shaped by fear but strengthened by something deeper. She approached slowly, stopping beside Hilton though her hands trembled. Warren's eyes lit with victory when he saw her. "Thought you could run forever?" he taunted. Clara swallowed hard but didn't back away. "I don't belong to you, Warren. Not now. Not ever." Warren laughed. Sharp, cruel, mocking. "You think this rancher can protect you? Think a bought wife can suddenly grow a spine?" Hilton's shoulders stiffened, but Clara's voice rose before he could respond. "I wasn't bought," she said, her words breaking like dawn through cloud. "I was given a chance. Something you never offered me." Warren's expression darkened, and he reached for Clara's arm. But Hilton stepped between them, the movement smooth and unmistakably final. "Don't," he warned, his voice low and deadly calm. Warren scoffed. "You'll fight me over a woman who isn't even yours?" Hilton's next words came without hesitation, clear enough to silence even the wind. "She is mine. Not because I paid for her. Because I choose her." Clara gasped softly, her lips parting in stunned disbelief. Warren lunged forward, fury igniting, but before he could strike, Hilton met him head-on. The clash was quick, fierce, and raw, not Wild West theatrics, but the stripped-down struggle of two men shaped by very different truths. Warren fought with entitlement. Hilton fought with purpose. It ended as fast as it began. Warren hit the ground, wind knocked from him, rage burning through the dust on his face. Hilton stood above him, voice steady. "Leave this valley. Don't return." Warren saw in Hilton's eyes a conviction unbreakable, a warning carved from bedrock. With a bitter curse, he scrambled to his feet, mounted his horse, and tore down the road in a storm of dust, defeated not by force alone, but by the unspoken truth that Clara would never again be under his power. When the sound of Warren's retreat faded into the hills, Clara exhaled a shaky breath, her entire frame trembling. Hilton turned toward her slowly, giving her room to step away if she needed, but she didn't. Instead she moved toward him, her eyes shining with tears that carried relief, awe, and something warmer. "Hilton," she whispered, voice breaking, You chose me." He reached out cautiously, brushing a stray tear from her cheek. "I did," he said. "And I'll keep choosing you, if you'll let me." The confession lingered between them, tender as a hand laid over a heartbeat. Clara bowed her head, emotion overwhelming her. "No one's ever chosen me before," she murmured. Hilton lifted her chin gently so she would see the truth in his eyes. "Then let this be the first time, Clara. The first of many." Her breath shuddered, and in that fragile moment she stepped into his arms, not out of fear, but out of finally feeling safe. But before either could speak another word, Tommy raced from the barn again, breathless with something urgent, something that made Clara stiffen and Hilton straighten in instant alertness. "Hilton!" Tommy cried, eyes wide as lantern light. Someone else is comin'. And it ain't Warren. Hilton turned toward the road, jaw tightening as another rider approached through the settling dusk, fast, determined, and unknown. And Clara whispered, almost to herself, I know that horse.